Murder and Such contains true stories about murders, the macabre, true crime, serial killers, and other dark subject matter. This includes adult themes, explicit language, descriptions of gore, violence, and other information provided by news articles, witness testimony, and public record. Murder and Such is not intended for all audiences, and although warnings will be set in place, listener discretion is still advised.
Well, hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Murder and Such. I am your host, Hunter. Now, typically with the show, I choose one particular case, and I usually go as deep as I can into the subject, the people involved, the perpetrator, and the victim or victims. Now, when I started the show 3 years ago this month, I didn't really know what to do with the format, and even in the last year, the format of this very show has changed. The one thing that our old host Brittany and I would do is usually choose one topic and then cover multiple smaller cases that follow that certain trend of discussion. I haven't done one of those in a while, and I think it would be rather interesting to try and do that for this episode. But before I get into the episode itself, I've got some of the good old housekeeping that I like to take care of. So I thank you all who have recently started listening to the show, and I'm not sure if it was honestly what it was that's helped my numbers, my followers grow, whether it was just telling a friend or even just searching for the show. I'm glad that you found it, and I thank you for being here with me. For my Patreon shoutouts, I would like to thank the incredible Miss Diane Castellon for joining the Patreon page and generously donating to the show. If you would like to join the Patreon page, you can find that at patreon.com/murderandsuch, or you can check murderandsuch.com for links to the Patreon and the PayPal if you feel like donating. A couple of more shoutouts that I'd like to throw out there are some new listeners who have been incredibly interactive with me in just giving me some very positive feedback. So a massive thank you to Miss Lauren Holmes and all of her friends in the art studio, and another thank you to Jessica Hale for also giving me some absolutely incredible feedback about the show. And if you would like to, you can follow Murder and Such on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Murder and Such. And the last series of thank yous is to all of the massive influx of 5-star reviews that I've received on Apple Podcasts lately. Honestly, it's super humbling to see such support and encouragement from all of you. And I'm hoping that maybe by the end of the year, I'll finally be able to hit 500 reviews on Apple Podcasts. That would be super awesome. So again, thank you for all the positive reviews. But of course, you're not here just to hear me thank every single one of you for being fucking awesome people. You want to hear about some murder. Well, let's dive into this case. It's a tale as old as time. And I don't mean to make this sound heartless, but in my 32 years, I feel like anytime there's a tragic event such as a mass shooting, a school shooting, or some sort of an attack against innocent civilians, there are usually a few things that will happen. More recently, it's leaned towards someone finding out the name, then scouring the internet for a Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, or TikTok video to try to find out what ideologies that this person had or possible political affiliations that they might hold. If a school shooter just happened to be a Trump supporter, Biden supporter, Gary Johnson supporter, or a constitutionalist, does that somehow make every single supporter of theirs the same kind of person? Of course not. People come in all shapes, sizes, demographics, and ideologies. Unless you're an avid Ted Cruz supporter, in which I'm automatically just going to think that you're the Zodiac killer in the making. That's a joke. But back in the 80s and 90s, people blamed it on the music. They thought that somehow, if you listened to Motley Crue, you were a practicing theistic Satanist who sacrifices children to the devil and has orgies covered in blood. Or if you listen to NWA or Wu-Tang, you were going to go off and kill law enforcement officers or become violent drug-dealing criminals. Again, that's almost never the case. But when it comes to music, the vast majority of boomers think that if you listen to the scary music, it's gonna make you a social pariah, a mass murderer, or the next John Wayne Gacy or Ted Cruz. It's almost never the case. But one consumable source of media has been lambasted since the early 1990s, and still, to this day, continues to get dragged through the mud as one of the most critically attacked sources, which Washington believes is the cause for violence, mass shootings, and murder. But as always, my name is Hunter, and you're listening to Murder and Such, and this is episode 66, Ctrl+Alt+Death. Ah, yes, video games. One thing that I personally hold near and dear to my heart. Of course, as I do with every episode, I'm gonna give you my personal opinion, but I'm also gonna give you sources, facts, and statistics about whatever topic that I'm talking about. But let's just break this down. Video games have been attacked since the early 1990s. In the days of the Atari 2600, the Sega Master System, or the original Nintendo Entertainment System, the graphics that were in those video games were pretty primitive by today's standards. You had your Super Mario Bros. 1 through 3 on the NES. On Sega, you had the blue man who just wants to go fast, Sonic the Hedgehog, but he wasn't too prominent as the company mascot, but there were some still really good titles for the Sega Master System, even though the Sega Genesis is what really made a name for Sega over here in the West. But most games were pretty, innocent? The graphics weren't too realistic, even though you had games with guns in them like Contra, Metal Gear, Bionic Commando, or weapons-based games like Castlevania, Gauntlet, or shooting fireballs out of your mouth like in Super Mario. When you look back at the Atari days, the graphics were even more muted and not even close to as detailed. But in the Atari days, there was one game that had caused a massive controversy. At the time, there wasn't a rating system in place for any sort of video games, but with the internet not being widely accessible until the late 1990s, a lot of people had to use video game magazines or word of mouth to find out what a game would be about. But a publisher and developer by the name of Mystique had made a game that debuted on September 23rd of 1982 named Custer's Revenge. Now, with a lot of Atari games, hell, even the Intellivision, Magnavox Odyssey, or other video game clones at the time, you had to somewhat use your imagination. But the main purpose of Custer's Revenge is as follows from the Custer's Revenge Wikipedia entry. Quote, "In the game, the player controls the character of Civil War Commander General George Armstrong Custer, depicted as a man wearing nothing but a cavalry hat, boots, and a bandana, sporting a visible erection. Custer has to overcome arrow attacks to reach the other side of the screen. His goal is to rape a Native American woman tied to a pole." End quote. Now, at the time, video games were seen as a fad, and even as fads come and go, this game garnered a metric fuck ton of attention from parents, children, and the media as well. The depiction of a disgraced Civil War general who was defeated at the Battle of Little Bighorn was out to get revenge by raping Native American women. And even with the primitive graphics, you can definitely tell that Custer had an erection about as long as his arm, which, obviously the developers are trying to compensate for something. And the Native American woman at the right side of the screen has exaggerated breasts and buttocks, but she is obviously of a darker shade of skin than General Custer. Now, the media focused on the game, and much like it happened with Beanie Babies, people flocked to the stores to get a copy of the game. The game also had a massive price tag on it of $50 American, which in today's money is the equivalent of $132. But even despite the high price tag, over 80,000 copies of the game were sold, which was twice as many copies of any other game that Mystique had published. But multiple activists on behalf of the Women Against Pornography cause, a spokesperson for the Native American Association, and other groups had petitioned to have the game banned from store shelves and outlaw the game, in which the city of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, actually did. But leaders in the video game industry had actually tried to pursue an $11 million lawsuit against Suffolk County, New York legislator Philip Nolan on his legislation that he was trying to pursue to get the game taken off of all store shelves completely. The leaders weren't having any of that, and the reason that they stated was that removing the game from store shelves would be a violation of their First Amendment constitutional rights. But after all of that happened, this was one of the first times that video games would find themselves in the spotlight for controversial reasons. Also, yes, this case will have true crime in it, but to me, it's just so interesting to see a medium that most of us use today, whether it be playing an Xbox, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, PC, or even our smartphones, Facebook, and tablets, was once seen as a niche interest. But in 2019, the video games industry raked in roughly $152 billion in revenue, so it's not like it's a very obscure hobby anymore. But as time goes on, pretty much like with anything in the tech world, things become more advanced, more seamless, and more realistic. Think back to the good old days of VHS, if you can remember those. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find a VHS or, God, what the hell do they call them? VCR player? And see, that tells you how fucking old I am. To find one of those at a big box retailer. What moved in from there was the attempts at Laserdisc, but then ultimately DVD is what cornered the market. After that, there was the battle between HD DVD and Blu-ray, with Blu-ray being the winner, and Toshiba taking a massive financial hit in that battle. Then along came streaming services like Netflix, Disney+, Hulu, and Apple TV+, but also displays became bigger, we got 4K Blu-ray, and like I said, things became much more realistic. With video games, with each new console iteration, from the NES to the Super Nintendo, from the Sega Master System to the Sega Genesis, from the PS1 to the PS2, everything became more fine-tuned, the graphics had gotten better, and even to this day, I still don't think that we've hit the full cusp on realism, although graphics are compelling enough to make you feel immersed in the gameplay, especially when it comes to VR gaming. Now, this episode is going to have 3 different true crime stories, and in between the stories, I'm going to give you a little bit more backstory on what happened with the video game industry, how it's evolved, how it became self-regulating, and then the correlation between violent video games and violent people. So let me start off with this one case, and I'll talk more about the evolution as time goes on. Now, Daniel Petrick was your average kid, born on August 24th of 1991 to Mark and Susan Petrick. They were an upper-middle-class family who lived in the town of Wellington, Ohio. Mark was a minister to the New Life Assembly of God, which, being a man of God, you can imagine the sort of strict household that Daniel might have been brought up in. But Daniel also had 2 sisters, and all 3 of them were pretty much set under what you consider a strict Christian household, so to say. But as Daniel grew up, he and his father spent much time playing sports, going hunting, and the typical things that most rural Ohioan father and son pastime activities would entail. As time goes on, kids grow up, they start learning things or experiencing things that they may not have grown accustomed to. Danny's sister Heidi moves out and gets married to another man by the name of Andy Archer, who eventually becomes the youth pastor at the same church that his father-in-law would preach at. Not much is known about Danny's other sister, though. But at the time, Danny's father had given him the opportunity to play some games by giving him an Xbox 360. And I may nerd out here and there when it comes to games, but Mark had implemented a rule in his house that was no violent video games. And some of the games that were available at the time were somewhat violent, and I can remember one game called Condemned Criminal Origins, which was lambasted across the internet for being way too violent for the time. But since the launch of the original Xbox in November of 2001, the console kind of had sort of a mascot and sold millions of consoles and copies based off of one franchise: Halo. Now, Halo is a game where you play the role of a soldier for the United Nations Space Command named Master Chief. The genre of the game is a futuristic first-person shooter. You're set out to protect the world and kill an invasive alien species, but with the tight gameplay and compelling storyline, it's a pretty good series and it's been critically acclaimed over the years. Sure, the guns used in the game are wildly out of the norm of what you could see people carry today, but the game is not meant to be completely realistic, as the game is also set in the 26th century. Now, this was most definitely a game that Mark wouldn't let Danny play. But as kids are growing up, there's different dynamics with different families, and when he found himself at a friend's house, he was introduced to several games that Mark would not approve of. This wouldn't be Danny's first run-in with having some violent video games, but I will say that kids are kids, and they'll almost always find a way to get their hands on a copy of a game like Grand Theft Auto if there's enough hype around it. There were a few times that Danny had said that he snuck out of the house at night and purchased some quote-unquote violent video games, and there were a few that Mark had found, and he eventually destroyed those titles. But at a later date, Mark had stated that his son Danny was a complete pathological liar and was incredibly proficient at manipulating people to his own advantage. He was noted saying that throughout most of Danny's life, he battled him on numerous occasions when it came to him not getting what he wanted, and there were severe instances of anger, irritability, and sometimes lashed out on Mark and Susan with violent tendencies or caused damage to their property. Somewhat of an underlying reasoning of why Mark and Susan could have used some maybe family counseling or professional intervention. But also, this kid is still pretty young, even at 16 years old. But sometime in the summer or fall of 2007, Danny came down with an absolutely massive staph infection that he got from a skiing injury and was practically homebound for a period of time. As many kids do today, especially in the wake of COVID-19, he had spent most of his time playing video games. And not long before the incident that takes place, on September 25th of 2007, the first appearance of Master Chief released on the Xbox 360 in the form of Halo 3. Now, Halo 3 was a borderline masterpiece by many people's opinions and critics, and this was the flagship title of the Xbox 360 for that time. So Daniel again had snuck out and purchased himself a copy of the game. Then he proceeded to seclude himself in his room, sometimes playing the game for up to 18 hours a day with his friends, throwing moderation completely out of the window. Obviously, this upset Mark and Susan, and on or around the 13th of October, his parents had intervened and taken away his copy of Halo 3. Obviously, Danny was pretty pissed off at this moment. Nearly a week goes by and his parents are not budging from his game. His anger fills, he starts plotting, and then he's still not getting his copy back. That's when Danny did the unthinkable. On October 20th of 2007, at around 6:30 p.m., Danny snuck into his father's room and obtained the key to his gun safe that they had frequented so many times before while going hunting. He took his father's 9mm Taurus PT-92 handgun and walked out of their room into the living room. It was a typical October Saturday in Ohio. A high of 66 degrees, a low of 54, so Mark and Susan were sitting inside on the couch and watching TV. Unbeknownst to them, Daniel stood behind the couch in the middle of the living room and he told his parents, "Would you close your eyes I have a surprise for you." Danny then pulled the 9mm handgun up to the back of Mark's head and pulled the trigger. Court documents later revealed that Mark was conscious and said that he could feel his head go numb, and he witnessed as blood was pouring out of his skull. Danny then pointed the gun at Susan and fired multiple rounds into her skull, arms, and her chest. Danny then took the handgun, wiped away anything that might have been on his hands from the handle of the pistol, then placed it into Mark's hand and told him, "Hey Dad, here's your gun. Take it." He then grabbed their keys, managed to track down his copy of Halo 3, packed up his Xbox 360, and left in the family van. In the meantime, Danny's sister Heidi and her husband Andy were en route to the house to watch a baseball game with their parents. When they approached the front door, it wasn't latched, and they walked into a scene of absolute horror. Mark was shot in the head, but still clinging to life. But Susan had already passed. They summoned the police and paramedics, in which they were able to get Mark to the hospital and eventually save his life. But unfortunately for Susan, she was pronounced dead at the scene. With Mark, he was still conscious the entire time when he witnessed his son killing his mother and attempting to make the shooting look like a murder-suicide. He could recall Danny tearing apart the house looking for the game. This child that he had raised had turned into his worst enemy that just tore his family apart. He had told the authorities that it was not a botched murder-suicide, but it was Danny who pulled the trigger and planted the gun. So the police ran the info and got the year, make, and model and plates of the van that Danny had escaped in. Shortly thereafter, a chase ensued, but the police were able to set up a barricade that was impenetrable to the van. When the van came to a stop, the police held Danny at gunpoint and forced him out of the car. And when he came out with his hands in the air, he screamed, "My dad shot my mom." Although, we all know that wasn't the truth. For Mark, he survived the attempt on his life. He went through a series of 5 separate operations to reconstruct his head and face, but he still replays the memories of that day in his mind every single day. He actually kept in touch with Danny while he was awaiting trial. He went from being filled with rage, resenting his son. This son of 16 years had pulled a gun on him and murdered his wife in front of his very own eyes. But over a copy of a video game? It's obviously something that can't be rationalized in any way, shape, or form. There is no justification for this actions, even with him being just only 16 years old. But with Danny, he would finally face trial over a year later on December 15th of 2008. He had opted not to have a trial by jury, considering many people were trying to have the death penalty pushed against Danny. But that would fall short considering Danny was a minor at the time of this murder. But when it came to his trial, I can't say if it's some moment of clarity or reminiscent of Mark's faith, but he actually learned to let go of the hatred and embraced his son. He wanted his son to be able to have a second chance at life, although he took the life of another. Danny's defense attorney had stated that he was under a considerable amount of stress due to the fact that he had such a horrible infection from a skiing injury, and stated that the family never really saw out professional intervention for Danny's anger and would rather put the church to work in trying to help Danny find a path of solitude with the teachings of Jesus Christ instead. Maybe it was a miscalculation in the parental department. I can't say that for sure. But what happened wouldn't be taken away. In Danny's eyes, he had stated in a later interview with a reporter from the Katie Couric show that, quote,
I didn't understand. Like I said, I was a teenager at the time. There's a difference between knowing something and understanding something, and understanding that I was taking a human life.
End quote. He later went on to talk about his mindset when he killed his mother, and he had said, quote,
I'm used to playing these games, and at the end of every round, everything just resets. At the end of every level, everyone is still there.
End quote. The reporter then asked Danny if he was blaming the video games for his murders, and he said, quote,
"No, I've always taken responsibility for it. I don't try to deny that. I know that it's nobody's fault but my own. Did it play a part? Yes. It was the catalyst behind the mindset that caused a murder."
End quote. At the end of his trial, Daniel Petrick was found guilty of murder on January 12th of 2009 and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 23 years behind bars, which was the lightest form of sentencing in a murder case such as his. His father Mark had testified that he believes Daniel deserves a second chance at making a better life for himself, and he has forgiven him for what he had done to him and his wife Susan. Daniel is currently still incarcerated at the Trumbull Maximum Security Prison in Leavittsburg, Ohio, and he will be eligible for parole when he is 39 years old. There is the first of 3 cases, and this will be a common theme with a small series for this episode. Danny had dealt with rage, depression, and anger at such a young age, and in his underdeveloped brain, considering he was a teenager, he wanted to exact revenge against his parents that stifled his gaming addiction. I will say that video games can be addictive, and with a lot of video games that are available today, there are some mechanics that can be considered gambling that can ultimately intensify the need or want to play a game for hours and hours on end. And there are certain games that have things called gambling mechanics in them, where the player might get a minute chance to get some good loot, kind of like Overwatch or Candy Crush with loot boxes. Which, this brings me to the next topic of evolution with video games: ratings. Everybody knows the Motion Picture Association of America has a rating system. You know, G, PG, PG-13, R, and NC-17. The video game industry also has a rating system in place. Their ratings are typically E for everyone, E, 10 and above for everybody over the age of 10, T for teen, mature, which should only be suitable for people over the age of 17, and AO, which is adults only after the age of 18, and the last one is RP, or rating pending, which you'll typically see that on trailers or box art mockups, since they haven't been rated yet by the ESRB or the Entertainment Software Ratings Board. But the ESRB has not always been there. The ESRB is a self-governing body of the video games industry that will give a rating like I previously stated, but on the back of a video game case and in the description of downloadable games, it will give descriptors that will tell you why they rated the games the way that they did. Such descriptors for a E or a E10 plus game may include comic mischief, cartoon violence, or maybe some crude humor. But when you start getting into some of the teen games, that can also include animated blood, sexual themes, mature humor, violence, or suggestive themes. Now, a lot more of the mature games will include some more severe things such as sexual themes, strong language, strong sexual content, blood and gore, mature humor, nudity, partial nudity, sexual violence, or use of alcohol, tobacco, or drugs. Games like The Last of Us Part 2, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, God of War, Halo the Master Chief Collection have all been rated M for mature. But games like Fortnite have been rated T for teen, and games like Minecraft are suitable for practically anyone. But for the adults only rating, there are very few games that have ever received that rating, because a lot of retailers like Walmart or the former Toys R Us stores or other big box retailers refuse to carry games with that explicit of a rating. In 1997 and 1998, games like All Nude Cyber, All Nude Glamour, and All Nude Nikki were rated adults only and only released on Mac or Windows PCs. The game Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was given an adults-only rating only after someone had found an exploit within the game's software, which included a mini-game stuck in the game's code called Hot Coffee, which included the main protagonist having sex and getting a blowjob from a non-playable character. It's worth noting that only the launch copies of the game that first came out had the exploit in there, and Rockstar Games later patched copies of the game for further release to exclude the Hot Coffee mod. Now, let's go back in time to the early 1990s. The Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis are now on the market, and there's been a port of a little-known game called Mortal Kombat. As I stated previously, the graphics between the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis from their last console release had increased dramatically, and with that, the violence also increased. Of course, we didn't have the internet at that time, but information about this game had started spreading around amongst constituents and citizens, which, as you can guess, made its happy ass up the food chain to the leaders and lawmakers of Congress. Now, Mortal Kombat wasn't the only game that was brought forward for C-SPAN watchers to gaze upon, but two more games called Night Trap and Lethal Enforcers were also on the congressional chopping block. One of the most pissed off congressional representatives was a Democratic senator from Connecticut by the name of Joe Lieberman. Oh, how much we love old angry senators putting their fingers in places that they don't belong. I'm looking at you, Ted Cruz. But much of the talking points that Joe had was that video games that kids were playing, like Mortal Kombat, pushed for kids to become more violent in everyday life because they were trying to mimic what they saw on the TV. With the game Mortal Kombat, this is what Joe had to say about it.
What you're about to see are scenes from two of the most violent new video games. First, we have Mortal Kombat, which is a martial arts contest involving digitized characters. We're going to show two versions of the game. In the first segment, which is Sega's version, blood splatters from the contestants' heads. When a player wins, the so-called death sequence begins. The game narrator instructs the player to finish, and I quote, finish his opponent. The player may then choose a method of murder, ranging from ripping a heart out to pulling off the head of the opponent with spinal cord attached. The second version, made by Nintendo, leaves out the blood and decapitation, but as you will see, it is still a violent game.
Unfortunately for Joe Lieberman, they couldn't figure out how to get the VCR working to start showing the clips of Mortal Kombat that he was talking about. So he then went on to start talking about good old Night Trap. Here's what he said about that.
The second game is Night Trap, which is a game set in a sorority house. The object is to keep hooded men from hanging the young woman from a hook or drilling their necks with a tool designed to drain their blood. Night Trap uses actual actors and achieves an unprecedented level of realism. What is particularly troubling about the scene in this film that we have an extract of is a graphic depiction of the violence against women with strong overtones of sexual violence. I find this segment deeply offensive and believe that it simply should be taken off the market.
Okay, let me back up about Night Trap a little bit. Night Trap itself is, honestly, it's a really shitty video game. It came out on the Sega CD console, and a lot of it used full motion video. The whole premise is that you play a special agent who controls security cameras at a teenage girl's sleepover house. And yeah, it sounds pretty raunchy by that meaning that you're looking at all of these teenage girls. But there's no nudity, there's no nothing like that. But the reason that you're watching them is that these girls are all in danger of these things called augurs. And augurs are these vampiric guys who are looking to capture and drain the blood out of these girls so that they can survive. All you do is you control these cameras and you set off traps when the little indicator light goes off. There's no nudity, there's no like bloody violence, but To be honest, it's probably the worst B-movie acting that you had ever seen, and in today's standards, it's seen as more of a comedy than any kind of a horror or violent game. It's kind of a cult classic, and the funny thing about that was the Nintendo representative Howard Lincoln had stated that a game like Night Trap will never be on a Nintendo console, but I actually have it installed on my Nintendo Switch. It's really just a shitty game. But the last game on Joe's shit list is Lethal Enforcers, and here is how Joe described that game.
One video game maker was announcing the release of yet another brutal video game which is called Lethal Enforcers. This game encourages players to shoot this gun, which is called a justifier. In other words, this is the handheld implement with which you play the game by shooting it at the screen, and the more successful you are, the more powerful the gun becomes.
At that moment in the congressional hearing, Joe Lieberman held up the Justifier, which was manufactured by a company named Konami. But the gun in question is a bright blue gun that looks like an oversized revolver. Sure, the name of the gun is the Justifier, which, yeah, I get there's a bad connotation, but there had been plastic gun accessories shipped with video games like Duck Hunt or Hogan's Alley since the original NES system came out. But in summation, Joe wanted legislation to ban and block the sale of violent video games because he had believed that if you can do it in a video game, you will do it in real life. With that, the video game industry had given an offer to regulate itself by implementing the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or ESRB, similar to how the MPAA regulates movies and the like. They had agreed, and the ESRB was born. Sure, there's still been controversial games that have come out over time, or they've even just been canceled from releasing. But even if the game is rated M for mature and has depictions of blood, gore, and violence, it doesn't automatically make people want to commit heinous acts, such as Danny Petrick. But what if a game is rated T for teen and doesn't involve practically any sort of blood, gore, or violence at all, except for maybe some tackling? That's what the second part of this episode is about. Tyrone Spellman was a 27-year-old man who lived in Philadelphia who had 3 prior run-ins with the law on drug charges. He wasn't incarcerated at the time, but what happened in September of 2006 would definitely make a name for himself in the national headlines. He was a father, and much like a lot of fathers these days, there's times where you just want to sit back, relax, and watch the game, or even play the game if you have a copy of Madden 2006. I will note that the Madden franchise releases every year and is always titled for the next year. Like Madden 2020 came out in 2019, so Madden 2006 came out in 2015. But Madden has been the go-to title for American football fans. Every year the rosters are updated, the graphics improve, and hell, between the original Xbox and the jump to the Xbox 360, the content was much more realistic. On that day, Tyrone wanted to fire up a game of Madden, which, I'll be honest, Madden games can get pretty damn intense. His 17-month-old daughter Aaliyah was hanging out in the living room, and her mother, which was Tyrone's girlfriend Mia, was taking a nap in the bedroom, and at the time she was also pregnant with Tyrone's second child. Everything seemed pretty routine, but we know how kids can be. They want to touch things, they want to get into things that maybe they shouldn't, and I may not be a parent, but I'm never going to say that being a parent is an easy job. But on that day, while Tyrone was deep into a match of Madden, Aaliyah was walking around the living room and found herself in front of a big white box with green flashing lights. So, as kids do, she started to mess around with it a bit, and then accidentally knocked his Xbox 360 off of the TV stand down to the ground, which prematurely ended Tyrone's game. Tyrone immediately screamed and became filled with rage, and what he did next was absolutely horrific. You have been warned. Tyrone got up and grabbed Aaliyah by the arm and threw her across the room. From there, she started crying out in pain, and that's when Tyrone walked over her and started punching her repeatedly in her head, neck, and chest. And when he was done, her lifeless body was moved near some dumbbell weights that Tyrone had in the place and draped her head across a few of the weights, then went and woke up Mia. When Mia came to, you can just about imagine what someone might be feeling when they wake up and their 1.5-year-old is now dead. So she calls the police and paramedics and waits anxiously as they arrived. Tyrone had told them that she had fallen and hit her head on the weights, and that's why her face was now bloodied, bruised, and she was no longer breathing. Obviously, they could tell that that was a bullshit lie. When the police came in, they rushed Aaliyah to the hospital, even though she was pronounced dead at the scene. They felt that they had enough evidence to bring Tyrone in for questioning, and they had asked him what had happened to her, and he said that while she was playing, she fell down and cracked her skull on the dumbbells. But they kept him there for multiple hours, and the reason why they did was they wanted a medical examiner to investigate what happened to his daughter while they questioned him. That's when the report came back and they found that Aaliyah had suffered from at least 5 blunt force punches to the face, which fractured her skull in multiple spots. She had rug burn on her leg and arm, most likely from being thrown, and her cause of death was ruled a homicide and definitely not an accident like Tyrone said. They immediately booked Tyrone in for first-degree murder, and he sat behind bars for nearly 1.5 years before he was finally convicted. But the other thing of note was after they did a full autopsy of Aaliyah, which, keep in mind, this little girl was only 17 months old. But they found that the attack that Tyrone did on that day was not the only injuries that she had sustained. After a complete autopsy, they had also found that about 2 weeks before the murder, she had suffered a broken arm as well. Now, after me looking further into this case, I had found that Mia and Tyrone had multiple domestic incidents in which Child Protective Services were called to intervene, but they had found nothing violent or out of the ordinary, and somehow they were able to hide Aaliyah's broken arm from the social workers. But considering this and Mia's inability to properly care for Aaliyah, the city of Philadelphia had actually taken custody of the child that Mia was pregnant with at the time of the murder. Now, I do want to touch on this a little bit because I can't find too much info on Mia, but from what it sounds, Tyrone was a loose cannon with a very short fuse. Needless to say that with him having domestic issues with Mia and Aaliyah, there very well could have been an intimidation factor that Tyrone was using against Mia that made her fear for any sort of retaliation. But when the trial finally came to, multiple factors were brought up about Tyrone. They said that he would often play video games for long periods of time, but they also talked about how he had a violent history. He was remorseful for the murder of his daughter, but his actions were still not justified. On January 30th of 2008, a jury convicted Tyrone Spellman for child endangerment and murder in the 3rd degree of his daughter, Aaliyah. And later on March 23rd of 2008, the judge has sentenced Tyrone to 22.5 years to 45 years in prison. The prosecuting attorney of the case, James Berardinelli, was quoted saying, quote, "I've been doing this for 13 years, and this is one of the few cases that's ever left me at a loss for words. There's never a good reason for murder, but this is just the pettiest of reasons." End quote. Tyrone is still behind bars to this day, and the soonest that he will be able to be paroled is when he is 51 years old. But this is a common theme when it comes to video games, and the older generation, yes, not all of them, but some of them think that violent video games will turn people violent. What about Madden? It's just football. As a lifelong gamer, with multiple video game tattoos on my body, my Xbox One, PS4, Nintendo Switch, gaming PC, I guess you could say that with my depression and irritability would cause spouts of rage, but have I actually taken that and hurt anybody in the process? No. Do I play violent video games? Absolutely yes. But Madden isn't inherently a violent video game. It's American football. It's playing as the Green Bay Packers and kicking the living shit out of the Minnesota Vikings. But it's no different than watching the game on TV, except for you actually control the quarterback in these games. Does watching football make people violent just watching on TV? I mean, sometimes. Like if you lost a bet, but that doesn't add any ammunition to the boogeyman concept that video games have been used for with political reasons, violence justification, or anything else that people may see as making other people violent. I would liken video games to hell, pretty much anything else. As a Second Amendment enthusiast, I can say that not all gun owners are violent and want to shoot people, but are there a select few that do? Absolutely. With drinking alcohol, some people may turn violent, but not all people do. Hell, even with people who drive cars, some people might want to drive 60 miles an hour through a farmer's market, but not all of them do. But it just seems that people think that just because you play video games, you're going to be a violent person. Which to my next point, the day after the congressional hearing where the ESRB was established, on December 10th of 1993, a little-known game by the name of Doom was released. Doom is also a first-person shooter, and honestly, it was one of the first of its kind aside from Return to Castle Wolfenstein. You're playing as the pivotal character known as Doom Guy, and you get an arsenal of shotguns, chain guns, pistols, a chainsaw, and even the mother of all guns in the game known as the BFG 9000. And if you're not a fan of Doom, the abbreviation for the BFG 9000 is it's Big Fucking Gun 9000. But Doom found itself in the crosshairs, pun intended, the same way that Marilyn Manson did after April 20th of 1999, when two men by the names of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold entered the Columbine High School in Columbine, Colorado, and at 11:19 a.m., they ended up taking the lives of 13 faculty and students, injured 21 more, and then turned the guns on themselves, ending what would be known forever as the Columbine Massacre. But of course, lawmakers and legislators were looking for a scapegoat. So Marilyn Manson, known for his shock rock live shows and his lyrics, was definitely targeted because Eric and Dylan had listened to him. But they also played video games like Doom. And if you look at how many people have purchased Doom over time, not to mention Doom 2, Final Doom, Doom 3, and then in 2016 they rebooted the Doom franchise, so now there's Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. You'd think that since millions and millions of people have played these games, but haven't even considered carrying out a mass shooting like Eric and Dylan did. Now, there have been countless studies over time, honestly even before the ESRB was brought to the table. Now, one that I found that I want to talk about is from the Dana Foundation. The Dana Foundation is a private philanthropic organization dedicated to advancing understanding about the brain in health and disease through research grants and public outreach. One that they had published was on November 1st of 2019. And this is a little noteworthy because if you've been a longtime listener of the show, you would know that on August 4th of 2019 at 1:05 a.m., Connor Betts went to the Oregon District and killed 9 people, including his own brother, before police had killed him outside of a bar in the Oregon District right here in my very own town. It's also worth noting that earlier in the day, on August 3rd, Patrick Crusius had walked into a Walmart in El Paso, Texas with a WASR-10 rifle and killed 23 people and injured 23 more. That, like it does time and time again, begs the question of why. As stated in the piece from the Dana Foundation, it said that the gunman who killed 23 people and injured 23 others at the Walmart in El Paso, Texas on August 3rd made a fleeting reference to video game soldiers, indicating that he was familiar with video game violence, and many politicians were quick to blame the video games for this and other mass shootings. In the wake of both mass shootings, President Donald Trump had made a jab at the fictitious boogeyman by publicly announcing this.
We must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately. Cultural change is hard, but each of us can choose to build a culture that celebrates the inherent worth and dignity of every human life. That's what we have to do.
Again, making video games the scapegoat of violence. But this piece also goes on to say, quote, "The main reason to worry about video games is a slew of studies claiming to find a link between violence in video games and real-world aggression. But countervailing studies have found no persuasive link. The main reason to be skeptical of the causal link is that video games have spread widely around the world without driving countries to the level of violence in this country. There is no hard evidence that such games lead to mass murders or grisly killings. Indeed, most correlation studies show, at most, a very small effect. Focusing on violent video games as the cause of mass shootings almost certainly distracts legislators and government officials from pressing the need to deal with more fundamental causes. It is a moral imperative for federal and state legislators, government officials, and all others concerned with lethal violence to confront the underlying problem and not take a symbolic refuge in blaming violent video games." End quote. I honestly can't say that I agree any more with Philip Boffey on more. He has a valid point. There is no correlation. Like I said, there are people who are violent who play video games, and there are people who are violent and own guns, but a small fraction of them could actually lead them to committing a heinous crime, such as the ones that have been carried out. But that's not indicative of all gamers or even most gamers. It's still a very select number of people that makes you wonder why America has more mass shootings than any other country on Earth. And why don't we pay attention to warning signs or still take mental health services seriously? I'm not gonna lie to you. I was a downright fucking angry kid, and my father could attest to that. But I also wasn't medicated, and I still played violent video games. Sure, people can have fleeting thoughts that can correlate with violent video games. Like, let's say you're playing the game Dark Souls, and let's say you maybe wonder what it's like to take down a giant jail demon with just a sword and a shield. But not everybody actually tries to do that, because trying to take down a jail demon like Ted Cruz with a sword and shield sounds like a very rare opportunity. But in recent years, there has been a new form of, I hate to call it a prank, but it's a prank that some people have played on video gamers that is incredibly dangerous. And in the final case for this episode, it actually turns deadly. In the last 10 years or so, there has been a massive influx of people playing video games for others to watch online, and they call it streaming. God, I fucking sound old as hell talking about this. But video game streamers like PewDiePie, Ninja, Dr. Disrespect, and other streamers have made a living off of playing video games, giving commentary, and people engaging with them, and honestly, having a damn good time. But with streaming and how advanced technology has grown over time, there's been ways that you could find out where somebody lives by acquiring their IP address. Now that leads to the next thing, which is called swatting. Swatting is an incredibly dangerous prank that some people will play on others, and it seems to happen more with video games than not. A swatting is where someone will find the name or address of somebody who might be streaming or someone that they're having a fight with online, and then they call in a fake phone call to the local police department, which usually involves an intent to commit a violent crime or a confession to a shooting of certain people, which the police are none the wiser in the situations, and they generally send police and sometimes SWAT officers to their house to handle the situation. That's where the term swatting comes from. The person involved with this incident would be a 25-year-old man by the name of Tyler Barris, in which he went by the online handle of Swatistic. So swatting, autistic, you get it. Tyler was actually homeless at the time and had multiple run-ins with the law, including a case of domestic violence, and he was released from the LA County Jail after 16 months after making false bomb threats to an elementary school in LA, a middle school in Grenada Hills, and a news station, KABC TV. This also included him being wanted by the Panama Beach, Florida police for making calls at least 30 times for fake bomb threats to various areas, including a high school in Florida. He was also wanted on fraud and mischief charges stemming from an incident in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, for harassing a woman within the city limits. Needless to say, this kid was fucking horrible. But this also involves two other men. One guy by the name of Casey Viner, also known as Vaporizer, and another man by the name of Shane Gaskill, who went by the username Miracle. They had been playing a match of Call of Duty World War II online and apparently got into an argument while playing matches on UMG, which is known for hosting tournaments online and is a decent place to flex your online skills. The two of them had apparently been embroiled in an argument regarding friendly fire. So friendly fire is when you're on a team with some other people, and a lot of games don't have this ability, but in games like Rainbow Six Siege, you can actually shoot and kill your fellow teammates, and it's not really the best thing to do, and it can also be frowned upon or get you booted from a match for doing so. But these two dipshits had apparently gotten into an argument about it, and one of the men made a $1.50 wager about the friendly fire. Well, they apparently had lost the match, which with most things, losing a tournament pretty much always sucks, but what would come next would prove deadly. Casey and Shane took their beef to Twitter, talking shit back and forth. Now, shit-talking in video games is pretty common, and a lot of companies have actually cracked down on people using abusive language, racist rhetoric, or other things that might upset another player or be deemed as inflammatory. To me, that's not necessarily a bad thing to keep the abuse down. I mean, video gaming is fun. Let's keep it that way. I mean, back in my online gaming heyday, I can recall how many people had told me that they fucked my mom, or they fucked my sister, or they fucked my grandma, or they fucked my dad, because I was kind of a force to be reckoned with on Call of Duty Black Ops. But rarely does this ever turn into anything except for somebody just having their feelings hurt, and, usually just people shit-talking them right back. I am sorry that I'm swearing so much in this episode. But this fight went on for a while, and on the evening of December 28th of 2017, Casey had enough of Shane's shit and threatened him that he was gonna have him swatted. In the video game culture, that's a big no-no. Keep in mind. Shane replied with an address which was located at 1033 West McCormick Street, Wichita, Kansas. With that information, Casey had contacted the man that I previously mentioned, Tyler Barris, who had nothing to do with the online match or fight, and Tyler went to a library in South Los Angeles and used their free Wi-Fi to use a voice-over IP service, which could help him mask his identity and his geolocation to the authorities. Now, since Tyler was no stranger to making fake police calls, he actually called up Wichita City Hall, which put him through to the dispatch for the Wichita Police Department. And with the transfer, it looked like the number was coming from the city of Wichita. Now, here is a clip of the phone call where it's the City Hall dispatch talking about what Tyler was saying. Tyler also used the name Brian in his phone call, and where he got that name, I have no idea. Here's that clip.
911, what is the location of your emergency?
Dispatch, this 582, stand by. Are you still on the line? Are you still on the line? Okay, I just had a person call down to the security desk at City Hall, and he said his mother had just hit his dad over the head with a handgun. Okay, I have his phone number, but for some reason, either he is hanging up or I can't transfer it. So I'm going to give you the phone number.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, I'll go ahead and try to call him back.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Now, after dispatch gets the number, she ends up calling him back, and this is what Tyler had said to her. And you did hear some beeps in there. That was him saying the name Brian. But here's that clip.
Hello?
This is 911. What's going on? Hello?
Yeah.
This is 911. What's going on?
I recently got disconnected. I had told you guys everything that happened about the argument with my mom and dad.
Okay. What's your address? Hello?
Yeah, it's 1033 West McCormick Street.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened.
They were arguing and I shot him in the head and he's not breathing anymore.
Okay, so what's going on right now? Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, do you have any weapons on you?
Yeah, I do.
What kind of weapons do you have?
A handgun.
What kind of handgun is it?
I don't know, it's my dad's.
What color is it?
It's black.
Where exactly are you at in the house?
By the closet.
Okay, what closet?
My mom's.
Where's that at in the house?
In her room, which is where she's at, and my little brother.
You have a little brother?
Yeah. I was on the phone with you guys earlier, telling you guys about it. I just got disconnected.
Okay. Well, we're going to try to get you some help. Where exactly in the house, like, is this a one-story or two-story house?
It's one story.
Is it towards the front of the house, the back of the house?
Well, like it's like towards the back, I guess. I'm just pointing the gun at them, making sure they stay in the closet. My mom and my little brother.
Okay, is there any way you can put the gun up?
No. Are you guys sending someone over here? Because then I'm definitely not going to put it away.
Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and stay on the phone with you, okay?
That's fine. Until they get here, or?
As long as you need me to, okay?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, because I already poured gasoline all over the house. I might just set it on fire.
Okay, well, we don't need to do that, okay?
In a little bit, I might.
Why would you do that?
You can tell that he's making shit up in this phone call. Not to mention with him just telling dispatch that he poured gas around the house and he's prone to actually lighting it on fire and killing everyone in the house, besides his father that he had already killed. The dispatcher is trying to keep him calm, but he keeps going on about when and if they're gonna show up, keeping the dispatcher hanging on with bated breath.
Do you have my address correct?
Can you verify it for me again?
It's 1033 West McCormick Street. My zip code is 67213.
Okay. So which way does your house face? Like, does your front door face north, south, east, west?
I don't know. It's just facing the street. My dad isn't breathing. It's kind of giving me anxiety, making me, like, paranoid. Hello?
I'm still here. I'm still here, okay?
Yeah, me too.
Okay, are you white, black, Asian, Hispanic? Are you there?
Yeah.
Are you white, black, Asian, Hispanic?
It was an accident, so.
Okay, that's fine. Are you there? Talk to me. Hello? Are you there? Hello?
And that's the end of Tyler's phone call. He had hung up the phone at this point, but the officers were still en route to the house, thinking that this man, Brian, was sitting at the house, holding his gasoline-soaked mother and sibling at gunpoint with his father on the ground, dead. And this guy was about to strike a match or a lighter and set the whole house ablaze. Police arrived on scene not knowing what they would walk into, but then again, Shane wasn't actually there. The address that he had given Casey on Twitter was a former address of his in the Wichita area in which his family used to live in until they got evicted from the house in 2016. So it begs the question of who lived in the house now? A 28-year-old man and father of two named Andrew Finch lived there. Andrew had nothing to do with the Call of Duty game, the police call, or anything involved with killing his father or about to set his house ablaze. When police arrived on scene, they didn't have a SWAT team with them, but normal officers, which you kind of have to admit, they're not trained in situations such as hostage negotiations or rescue attempts. They surrounded the house and then announced that they were on the scene with a spotlight shining at the front door. With Andrew being inside, he had heard something and went outside to check on what was going on, and then he saw that the officers were there with a spotlight directly on him. They started issuing commands, and the police had told him to raise his hands and walk towards them. It's worth noting that Andrew's mother Lisa was in the house at the same time as well. This next audio clip was released by the Wichita Police Department from the body cam footage.
Walk this way! Walk!
In the video clip, you heard "walk this way," and Andrew dropped his arms for just a hot second, and the police fired a round out of a Colt AR-15 rifle and shot through Andrew's right lung and his heart. He was transported to the nearby St. Francis Hospital, where he would later be pronounced dead. Officer Justin Rapp of the Wichita Police Department testified that he had seen a gun in Andrew's hand, and that's why he fired the round that killed him. But later in May of 2018, he had testified that he saw Andrew make a motion with his hand, which he was still unarmed and had no earthly idea what was going on. Andrew had nothing to do with this game match, this online shitfest, and he didn't even know who these three little assholes were. Andrew was completely innocent and died for no reason whatsoever. There was also a public outcry about why there was only that short cam clip released to the public and what could have transpired before and after the shooting took place. It's no secret that, obviously, the police had fucked up in this situation, but they were also not properly trained for a standoff such as this one. After the shooting, the police had actually come into the house and taken 2 phones, a computer, and other electronics, trying to figure out what or how this could have happened. They had actually handcuffed Andrew's family because there was something definitely wrong with whatever the hell had just happened. Who was Brian? Where was the dead father? What the fuck was going on? And why did this man also get shot from 100 yards away with no warning? The citizens of Wichita were furious, and not to mention, Andrew's mother had been lost in a haze that her son had just been killed by police, and the fact that she had to write a letter to the mayor of Wichita asking for the remains of her son to be released, since after about a week since the shooting, they wanted to give Andrew a proper funeral service and burial. In a situation like this, Andrew's mother had gotten an attorney because someone had to pay for his wrongful death. But the day after the shooting, the police had finally caught up with Tyler Barris as they tracked the IP address from his cell phone and located him using cell phone triangulation. They had also been looking for him considering that he had a warrant for his bomb threats that he made to the news station and schools. Later, he would be extradited to Kansas and was charged with the involuntary manslaughter charges, but was being held at the Sedgwick County Jail in the meantime. The other 2 men involved, Casey Viner and Shane Gaskill, were indicted on May 23rd of 2018 and given a slew of charges related to the incident as well. For Tyler, he was being charged with false information and hoaxes, cyberstalking resulting in death, making threats of death or damage to property by fire, interstate threats, conspiracy to make false reports, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Shane Gaskill was charged with obstruction of justice, wire fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice, but a month and a half later, Shane was re-indicted on additional charges that had been found that Shane had mocked Barris to try again after the fatal shooting of Andrew Finch instead of the shooting of Shane himself. For the officer involved, there was an internal investigation, and no officers were brought any charges for the wrongful death of Andrew Finch. But for Shane Gaskill, he had struck a deal with the prosecution for a deferred judgment in which all charges were dropped against him. For Casey, he had pled guilty to conspiracy and obstruction charges of April of 2019, and he was sentenced to 15 months in prison in September of that year and given 2 years of probation when he's released. But the additional part that they added to his probation is that Casey will be barred from playing any video games during his probation at all. Again, attacking the boogeyman, but for the sake of the general public, I hope that this little asshole never touches another video game ever again. Now let's get to Tyler. All of his prior warrants and crimes had finally caught up to him, to the point where on October 26th of 2018, an additional 46 charges were pressed against that little fucker, which included fake threats of bombs, fake shooting reports, financial fraud, and multiple other crimes that included co-conspirators that were not indicted from the states of Florida, Missouri, Michigan, and Illinois. Since he had been falsifying information for a long time, he pled guilty on November 13th of 2018 to 51 federal charges and was subsequently handed down 20 years in prison, which included 150 months in Kansas for the shooting of Andrew Finch, 90 months in California for his bomb threats, and 30 months in prison for the bomb threats that he made in Washington, D.C. All of these sentences are also supposed to run consecutively. He will be eligible for release at the age of 45, but part of me hopes that this little asshole never sees the light of day ever again. As for some of the aftermath of the incident, it's not the first time that someone has been swatted by internet assholes like that. There had been many, many incidents, and you can even go on YouTube and see swatting incidents that were recorded by the people who had the police falsely called on them. But this one is one of the very few instances where a swatting had actually led to somebody being wrongfully killed by the police departments. The Kansas legislature had approved of a new bill in March of 2018 to establish creating a false alarm resulting in the death or injury as a Class A felony. And then a bill was adopted by the House of Representatives known as the Preventing Swatting and Protecting Our Communities Act of 2018, in which the penalties would be a 5-year imprisonment sentence for providing authorities with false information with the intent to cause an emergency response. Now, if the person is injured in the process, the perpetrator could be sentenced to up to 20 years in prison. And if the person is killed in the act, the person will face life in prison. Now, the bill had been sent to the House of Representatives Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, and Investigation Councils. But unfortunately, the bill had died in the process and was never taken up for a vote. But a new attempt at trying to amend the Communications Act of 1934 wanted to add enhanced penalties for the transmission of misleading or inaccurate caller identification information with the intent to trigger an emergency response. This has also been sent to the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, but a formal vote has not yet taken place. So Tyler got what he deserved, but I still don't think that he should be let out of prison. Because honestly, he's a menace to society, and hopefully he can be reformed in prison, but I honestly just don't know. I don't know if he can or will learn the weight of his actions, but video games are something that I very much feel strongly about, and the video game had almost nothing to do with this incident. I know, this show is called Murder and Such, and this is more of an and such kind of episode, with murders also taking place. But I think that the underlying issue that we have with something like this isn't that video games can cause people to become violent. I think there could be a number of underlying psychological or mental health reasons, but politicians and soccer moms want to blame the boogeyman as they always do, because as a nation, we don't take mental health very seriously, and I think that instead of trying to spend taxpayer dollars on trying to outlaw video games on a grand scale, could better be used trying to adopt more widespread social services. Because kids are always going to get their hands on something that's seen as taboo. When I was younger, we weren't allowed to have Nerf guns in my house, but about 50 feet away from me in the basement under my butt where I watched Saturday morning cartoons, my dad had his gun cabinet and hunting gear. Sure, I had fought with my dad multiple times when I was younger, but nothing made me want to go grab a gun and shoot my dad. Hell, here's a little bit more backstory. When I was younger, I was obsessed with my PS1 when I was a kid, and also around that time, I stole a bike from the local mall and I registered it at our very own police department. It didn't take CSI or the FBI to figure out that, when somebody reported their bike stolen, the cops came to my house and they took the bike back. And this resulted in my mother taking a ball-peen hammer to my PS1, which I will also note had a Game Shark clipped to the back of it, to make me realize the gravity of what I had just done. Was I pissed? Yeah, of course. Did I resent my parents? Absolutely. But where my $150 console took a bath in a shower of steel smacks, I didn't want to kill my parents. And at the time, I was playing games like Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil 2, and other games that were deemed violent. The moral of that is that you can't blame the video games because it's an easy scapegoat that a lot of older people just really don't understand. It's a chance to leave this world and take up a digital avatar to embark in a different world with a different scenario and just get away from in today's day and age, things are super divisive and toxic. So if I can hop into Crash Bandicoot and kick Cortex's ass, or fire up Super Mario to save the princess, or even load up The Last of Us Part 2 and exact revenge on the people that have done me wrong, it's a much different and much healthier outlet than trying to take care of those things in real life. To me, I think that mental health services are necessary and they can save lives, and I think that we should focus more on that rather than keep on blaming video games for somebody taking violent actions against somebody else. Because statistically, it's just not true. And most, if not all, the people who have done heinous acts and people who have blamed the games for some sort of justification, almost all of those people had an underlying issue that was never addressed. Mental health is important to me, and from what I've gathered, it's important to a lot of people who listen to this show. So please, be sure to check in on the ones that you love, because times like this are particularly troubling for a ton of people. So as I say in a lot of episodes, today, try to give someone a call that you love. Try to talk to them, tell them that you're there for them, especially your funny friends, because it's really easy for your funny friends to hide the pain and troubles behind some sort of comic relief. But I think that it's pretty cut and clear of video games aren't really the issue. And what was once seen as a niche product or hobby is now a worldwide phenomenon. Chances are that you actually have a video game console at home, or a PC, or even you like playing Candy Crush on your iPhone. Video gaming is here to stay. But how are we going to address the underlying issues? That's what the real question is all about. But that's going to do it for this episode. And I thank you for listening to my tangents and really some horrible stories about this. Now, I do want to give a very special thank you to my executive producers who donate $5 or more per episode on Patreon. So a massive thank you to Sarah Thompson, Martha Pierce, Benjamin Welch, Dan Sheridan, Stacy Jenks, Justin Reebsum, Alex Eggwire, William T. Dawson, and then of course Ashley Black and her wonderful husband, Dan Tech Support. And if you would like to join those lovely folks and help donate to the show, you can visit patreon.com/murderandsuch, and the only tier that I have is $1, but of course you can donate more if you would like. Be sure to follow Murder and Such on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Murder and Such, and you can follow me on my personal pages and video game stuff on Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, the PlayStation Network, and Steam at Huntor27. And like I mentioned in the last episode, if you would like to follow my shit-posting Instagram where I put a poorly photoshopped picture of Peppa Pig up every day or so, you can find that on Instagram at Poor Peppa Pig, as in Poor Peppa Pig. And if you would like to, you can also feel free to drop me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. I'm hoping to be at about 500 by the end of the year, so let's see if we can do it. But here's to another year of Murder and Such, another year of your guys' unwavering love, support, another year of true crime bullshit. And honestly, I really do appreciate you all for everything that you've done for me. I love each and every one of you guys, but I'm not going to stop saying that please wash your fucking hands. But until next time, I will talk to you soon. Take care.